3 disturbing true horror stories. Number 1. The Bay Window.
One cold winter night, a 15-year-old girl named Susan Stone was home alone, watching TV. Her parents had gone out to a party at a friend's house. It had been snowing heavily all afternoon, but Susan felt nice and snug as she sat on the couch in the living room, tucked up under a warm, fuzzy blanket. By midnight, Susan's parents were still not home, and she began to feel uneasy. She didn't want to call them, they might think that she couldn't take care of herself. The television was in the corner of the room, right next to a big bay window. She was watching one of her favorite movies, a horror film named Prom Night, when suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something moving in the bay window. Through the darkness and the falling snow, she could make out the figure of a man, walking towards the window. As he got closer, she was able to make out his face and it filled her with terror. The man's face was hideously scarred, his eyes were wild and crazy and he seemed to be grinning at her. Frightened, Susan pulled the fuzzy blanket over her head and tried to hide. She was too scared to move. Slowly, she pulled the blanket aside just enough to peer out with one eye. The man was still there. He was just standing there, staring directly at her as the snow fell behind him. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled something out. It was a long knife. Terrified, Susan pulled the blanket back over her head and hoped that the madman would think it was just a pile of blankets sitting on the sofa. She managed to move her hand slowly over to her pocket and took out her cell phone. Pressing the buttons in a panic, she dialed 911 and held her breath as she waited for an answer. When the operator asked, "What is your emergency?" Susan put the phone close to her face and whispered, "There's a man outside my window. He's got a knife. Please come quickly." She sat motionless under the blanket as the minutes ticked by. Eventually, she heard sirens outside and the police started banging on her front door. Susan pulled off the blanket and rushed to the front door, letting the 2 police officers inside. They said they had seen no trace of anyone outside her house. "He was right there," said Susan, pointing out the bay window to her snow-covered front lawn. "That's not possible," said the female officer. "There couldn't have been anyone standing out there. The snow is completely undisturbed. If there was someone out there, they would have left footprints. But he was standing right there, staring at me," said Susan. "I saw him with my own 2 eyes." "You know, your eyes can play tricks on you," said the male officer. "Maybe you've been watching too many scary movies." The officers turned to leave when, all of a sudden, the female officer stopped dead in her tracks. She pulled back the sofa that Susan had been sitting on. Her jaw dropped and her eyes widened in shock. Susan and the male police officer gasped. On the carpet behind the sofa, there was a trail of wet footprints and a large knife. "You weren't looking at the man outside the window," said the female officer. "You were looking at his reflection. He was standing right behind you."
Number 2. The Woman in the Night.
Jim moved into an apartment in a quiet city suburb. The first night he slept in his new apartment, he was awakened at about 2 o'clock in the morning, by a knock on his door. When he got up and answered the door, he found a young woman standing there. She apologized for waking him and told him that she was his neighbor. Her husband had threatened her and she asked if she could spend the night on his couch. She promised that she would get up early the next morning and call her family to pick her up. Jim nodded politely and agreed to let her stay. Although it seemed strange to him, her got her settled comfortably on the couch and then went back to bed. The next morning, as soon as he got up, he discovered that the living room was empty and the woman had already left. He assumed that her family had probably come to pick her up early and she was now safe. That night, at the same time as before, there was a knock on his door. It was the same young woman. She told him that her husband had threatened her again and asked if she could spend another night on his couch. The next morning, he woke up to find that she had disappeared again. Jim grew suspicious and asked the landlord of the building about his strange neighbor. The landlord's face grew pale and she said that the apartment beside his was unoccupied. She said that the woman who lived there had died last year, after being killed by her husband.
If you like this video, please subscribe to our channel.
Number 3. The Boy on the Mountain Road.
One night, a young married couple was driving down a mountain road. Suddenly, they saw a young boy jump out in front of their car. The husband slammed on the brakes and the car skidded to a halt. When he looked up, the boy had disappeared. Looking outside, the couple realized that the car was perched on the very edge of a cliff. If the husband hadn't slammed on the brakes at that exact moment, they would have driven right over the edge of the cliff and fallen to their deaths on the rocks below. For a few seconds, they sat in shocked silence. Then, the wife said, "The little boy saved us. He must have been a good spirit sent to warn us." There was a few more seconds of silence and then the couple heard a child's voice behind them angrily say,
"You're supposed to die."